Why good people suffer most. Dostoevsky's dark truth. Why do the kindest, most thoughtful, most selfless people so often carry the heaviest burdens? Why do those with the softest hearts seem to be the ones life strikes the hardest? If you've ever looked at the world and felt like something about that equation doesn't add up, you're not alone, and neither was Fyodor Dostoevsky. One of the greatest philosophical novelists of all time, Dostoevsky wasn't interested in surface-level answers. He lived in the questions. He stared directly into the abyss of human suffering, not to escape it, but to understand why it exists, especially for those who deserve it least. And what he discovered isn't just relevant, it's haunting. Because Dostoevsky didn't believe that suffering was random. He thought it followed a pattern, a logic, a brutal spiritual algorithm. And at the center of that algorithm, we find the good, the truly good, broken, tested, humiliated, and often destroyed. But why? Why does the universe seem to place its heaviest weight on the shoulders of those least equipped to carry it? Let's take a step back. Imagine you're someone who feels deeply. You notice the pain in others. You care about injustice. You reflect before you act. You question your motives. You try to do the right thing, even when it costs you. That sounds like strength on the surface, right? But here's the dark twist. The very qualities that make someone morally good also make them psychologically vulnerable. Why? Because to be good is to be sensitive. And to be sensitive is to feel more. And to feel more is to suffer more. Not because you're weak, but because you're open. Because you refuse to numb yourself. Because you choose to care in a world that rewards indifference.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Dostoevsky understood this intimately. He wasn't a philosopher in an ivory tower, he was a man sentenced to death, only to be spared at the last second. He was a man who spent years in a Siberian prison camp, surrounded by cruelty and degradation, yet still managed to write some of the most compassionate, soul-searching literature in history. His characters like Prince Myshkin in The Idiot or Alyosha in The Brothers Karamazov aren't caricatures of goodness. They're painfully human. They love. They forgive. They try to save others. And yet they suffer. Not in spite of their goodness, but because of it. And that's the paradox. The good person suffers not because the world is evil, but because the world is confused. Because when you show love in a place built on fear, people see you as weak. When you offer forgiveness in a culture obsessed with punishment, people see you as naive. When you choose vulnerability over domination, people see you as foolish. And the good suffer because they don't play the game. And the game punishes those who refuse to play. But there's another layer, one even darker and more profound. Dostoevsky believed that suffering was not merely a side effect of goodness. He believed suffering was necessary for moral transformation. That without suffering, we remain shallow. That pain sharpens the soul, deepens the heart, strips away ego, and reveals what truly matters, and that the good suffer because they are called to a higher depth of consciousness that others never reach. And that calling is not glamorous. It's not rewarded. It's not even always visible. But it's real. Let me ask you something. Have you ever gone through a pain so deep, so personal, that it changed you not just emotionally, but philosophically? Did it make you kinder? Did it make you more aware of others' suffering? Did it give you a kind of wisdom you couldn't have found in any book? If so, then you've already stepped into Dostoevsky's world. You've already touched the edge of what he believed to be the central mystery of human life, that the road to meaning almost always runs through the valley of suffering. But this doesn't mean we should glorify pain. That's not the point. Suffering in and of itself is not noble. What is noble is the way some people respond to it. Most people, when they suffer, grow bitter. They harden. They build walls. But the good, the truly good, somehow find a way to stay open, to suffer without becoming cruel, to feel everything and still choose love. That's not just rare, that's revolutionary. Dostoevsky wasn't offering us comfort. He wasn't writing motivational posters. He was giving us something far more powerful, permission to feel the full weight of life without losing our humanity. He was showing us that the suffering of good people isn't proof that goodness is weak, it's proof that goodness is real. Because only what is real can bleed. And maybe that's the truth we're most afraid to face. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What if your suffering isn't a sign that something is wrong with you, but a sign that something is right? What if your pain is not evidence of your failure, but evidence of your depth? What if the fact that you feel so much is not your weakness, but your power? The weight of the soul, why conscience makes you a target in a corrupt world. There's a quiet burden that every good person carries, and it's not talked about enough. It's the weight of conscience. Not the superficial kind that simply tells you what's right or wrong, but the deep, soul-shaping force that refuses to let you take the easy way out, even when no one is watching. The kind of conscience that keeps you awake at night, not because you did something wrong, but because someone else did, and you wonder if you could have stopped it. It's a moral sensitivity that doesn't shut off. And in a world increasingly built on convenience, shortcuts, and self-interest, that kind of soul is not just rare, it's a threat. Dostoevsky understood this better than almost anyone. He saw how conscience isolates the good person. Not because they want to be alone, but because the world often leaves them no other choice. When you carry a conscience into a world that's abandoned its own, you become a mirror. And people don't want mirrors, they want masks. They want validation, not reflection. So when someone walks into a room and refuses to play the game, refuses to lie, refuses to exploit, something incredible happens. The room turns on them. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because their presence exposes everything false around them. But this is why good people suffer most, not just because life is hard, but because they are awake in a world that prefers sleep. When you're awake, you notice things. You see the cruelty beneath the surface. You feel the weight of choices other people treat as trivial. You carry guilt that isn't even yours. And while others move through life with the numbness of indifference, you're haunted by the question, am I doing enough? Take a moment to really ask yourself this. Have you ever walked away from a situation and felt the soul-deep ache that comes not from what you did, but from what you couldn't do? From the silence you didn't break, the injustice you couldn't stop, the person you couldn't save. That ache, that unbearable tension between your ideals and reality, that's the weight of conscience. And it doesn't go away, because it's tied to love, to humanity, to the belief that things could be better, should be better, and that somehow you're responsible for trying. But here's the tragedy. The world doesn't reward that kind of moral clarity. It punishes it. Promotions go to the pliable. Praise goes to the agreeable. Platforms are given to the loud, not the wise. And so the person with the strongest conscience often finds themselves pushed to the margins, misunderstood, underestimated, sometimes even mocked, because their refusal to compromise makes others uncomfortable. Pain and discomfort, in a culture addicted to distraction, is treated like a sin. Dostoevsky's novels are full of these characters. People whose conscience makes them suffer more deeply than others can imagine. Think of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, a man who tries to silence his conscience with ideology, only to be crushed by it in the end. Or Ivan Karamazov, who intellectually rejects God because he cannot reconcile divine justice with the suffering of innocent children, but who is quietly tormented by the very moral impulse that drives the question. These are not just literary figures. They are philosophical archetypes, reflections of every person who has ever tried to live ethically in a system that rewards the opposite. And yet, Dostoevsky doesn't leave us in despair. He shows us that conscience, though it causes suffering, is also the seed of transcendence. It's what keeps us human, what keeps us from becoming monsters. It's not just a burden, it's a calling. And that calling is not to be perfect. It's to remain awake, to keep feeling, to keep acting, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. So let me ask you, what might it look like if you stopped seeing your sensitivity as a flaw and started seeing it as your edge? What if your ability to feel guilt, to wrestle with moral tension, to care about things that seem small, and to others, what if that's not your weakness, but your superpower in a world so morally numb it can't even feel its own decay? Because maybe the reason you suffer more isn't because you're failing, but because you refuse to fail yourself. And in a corrupt world, that refusal is the most courageous thing you can do. The sacred wound, how suffering becomes the gateway to meaning, there is something holy about a wound that refuses to close. Not because pain itself is noble, but because some pain awakens us to truths we could never grasp otherwise. Dostoevsky believed that suffering wasn't just a consequence of life, it was a requirement for transformation. And the more I've lived, the more I've seen what he meant. There are certain realizations, certain depths of empathy, certain awakenings of the soul that only emerge after the heart has been shattered. And this is where the sacred wound begins to reveal its paradox. The very thing that breaks you may also be the thing that builds you. But let's be real when we're in the middle of it, when we're bleeding emotionally, when we feel abandoned, misunderstood, or crushed under the weight of loss. The idea that suffering could be meaningful feels like a cruel joke. And that's part of the tragedy. Meaning doesn't always arrive during the storm, it often comes long after, in the silence that follows, in the rebuilding that begins, in the person you become because of what you endured. Dostoevsky didn't romanticize suffering, but he didn't say it was beautiful. He said it was inevitable. But more than that, he said it was necessary not for everyone, but for those who seek truth, depth, and moral clarity. When you suffer, the world strips away its illusions. Suddenly, things that once felt important, status, appearances, empty praise, feel utterly weightless. You begin to see through people, through institutions, through yourself. You realize how fragile everything is, how temporary, how false. And strangely, that realization doesn't destroy you, it frees you. It's like your ego dies before you do, and in its place, something quieter, truer, and more grounded begins to take root. You start to live from a different place, not the surface, but the center. This is the sacred wound. The pain that doesn't just hurt, but instructs. The loss that doesn't just take, but awakens. The suffering that doesn't just scar, but sanctifies. You begin to notice beauty in places you never looked before. You begin to value silence, sincerity, presence. You start showing up for others not because it's expected, but because you feel their pain with a level of understanding you never had before. And they can tell. Because real empathy can't be imitated, but it's carved into you by your own suffering. Dostoevsky once wrote that suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. That's a bold claim, but think about it. When have you grown the most? When you were comfortable, or when you were broken? When have you questioned your beliefs, challenged your assumptions, redefined your values? In moments of ease or in moments of crisis? The truth is, pain shakes us free from the sleepwalk of routine. It pulls us into the present. It forces us to confront what we've been avoiding. And in that confrontation, we either collapse or we wake up. And what does it mean to wake up? It means seeing that life isn't fair and choosing to love anyway. It means realizing you can't control what happens, but you can choose who you become through it. It means accepting that suffering is real and still refusing to let it close your heart. But here's the hardest part: the sacred wound never fully heals. Not because it's broken, but because it becomes part of you. Like a scar on the soul, a reminder of what you've survived and what it taught you. And in a strange way, you become grateful for it. Not because you wanted it, but because you wouldn't trade the depth it gave you for anything. So let me ask you, what if the thing that hurt you the most is also the thing that made you who you are? What if your pain is not just something to overcome, but something to honor? What if your suffering didn't ruin you, but revealed the part of you that was always real? Because maybe the wound isn't where life ended. Maybe it's where life began, becoming the light. Why the world needs those who've suffered well. We live in a world desperate for light. Not artificial light, not the polished glow of curated happiness or performative virtue, but a real, steady light. The kind that comes from people who've walked into the deepest night of the soul and come out the other side not untouched, but transformed. These are not saints. They are not superheroes. They are people like you and me, only they've chosen to suffer well. And in doing so, they become what Dostoevsky believed to be the rarest and most necessary kind of human being, someone who has seen the worst of life, and felt the weight of it fully, and still refuses to let the darkness have the final word. To suffer well doesn't mean you enjoyed it. It doesn't mean you smiled through it. It means you didn't let it destroy your capacity for love. It means you let pain do what only pain can do: break you open without breaking you apart. And that kind of person becomes a lighthouse for others. Why? Because the world is full of people in silent agony. People who are aching, grieving, lost, but hiding it behind smiles, jokes, careers, routines. And when they meet someone who has suffered and survived, someone who carries their pain with dignity rather than shame, it reminds them that healing is possible. Dostoevsky's characters are often tormented, but they aren't nihilists. Even in their darkest moments, they search sometimes desperately for meaning, for love, for redemption. And that's what makes them unforgettable. He knew that the human soul is not destroyed by suffering, it is destroyed by meaninglessness. So when you suffer and you find meaning, when you suffer and you grow kinder, when you suffer and you don't give up, you become a living answer to the most fundamental question anyone in pain is asking: can I survive this and still be whole? And here's the truth: the world doesn't just need your productivity, your skills, your opinions. It needs your presence, your wisdom, your compassion, your story. It needs the version of you that suffering carved out. The version of you that's no longer obsessed with being impressive, but is now committed to being real. Because we have enough noise, enough pretense, enough shallow positivity that can't hold up under pressure. What we don't have enough of are people who've been through hell and returned with grace. That doesn't mean you have to be perfect. It doesn't mean you have to have it all figured out. It just means you show up, authentically, tenderly, with eyes that have seen too much and a heart that still chooses to remain open. That is what the world needs, and that is who you become when you suffer well. So let me ask you one final time, what if your story, your whole story, including the pain, the failures, the losses, wasn't something to hide, but something to offer? What if the point wasn't to avoid suffering, but to alchemize it? What if your life isn't meant to be polished, but true? Because in the end, Dostoevsky wasn't just writing about suffering, he was writing about transcendence. He was showing us that the path to the highest form of love, of wisdom, of humanity isn't found in avoiding pain, but in walking through it with courage, conscience, and compassion. So if you've suffered, if you're suffering now, and you're still here, still loving, still trying to be good in a broken world, then you are the light. You are the reason someone else will believe it's possible to survive and still be whole. And that is no small thing. Thank you for being here. Your pain has not been wasted. You are the proof that goodness can endure even in the darkest places, but especially there.